WoD. Arguably WoW's worst expansion for a lot of reasons, and easily its shortest when it comes to content too. Warlords of freaking Draenor, man. But while it may be quite infamous for its lack of content, I would argue there's a saving grace here in that it's designed extremely well, giving us that kind of it's shallow but what we got was pretty freaking amazing vibe. And while the story is pretty half-baked,
but we will be conquerors.
Say psych.
Draenor is free!
Please say psych. I don't think it's so intrusive that it ruins some of WoD's better qualities. Kinda like if your mom was making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but then she had a stroke and started stapling chicken nuggets to it. I mean, you would still have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and now you'd have some chicken nuggets. You just need to pick out the metal bits. The zone design is quite good, especially in scope, and heck, even the regular dungeons are all pretty decent. Well, except for Bloodmaw slag mines.
Trash!
Of course, we aren't here to talk about any of that stuff. Well, yet at least. We're here to talk about raids. All 3 of them. Yup, as I stated, WoD is quite a bit short on content, and raids sadly are a part of that package. But much like everything else in WoD, except Bloodmaw slag mines, these 3 raids are, well, really good actually. Dare I say some of the best in the history of the game. And yes, I said raids, as in all 3 of them are fantastic. Honestly, this is probably one of the most positive rankings I've ever made, because realistically all of WoD's raids do a lot of things right, more so than wrong. The overall core layout of these raids is extremely approachable, and oftentimes Blizzard really pulled out some fun ideas when crafting a lot of the bosses in each raid, ultimately balancing both the fun and challenge in a pretty solid way. I know I haven't released the Pandaria raid ranking yet, and trust me, it's in the works, but it's much longer, so I figured I'd go ahead and get this one out a bit early. So stay tuned for that one later on. Well, there are only 3 of these raids, so let's get these bad boys knocked out, shall we? Starting with Draenor's greatest raid. When creating a great or even amazing raid, it's important to remember that fantastic boss design and approachable layout are fundamental to creating a cohesive experience. So with that in mind, it should be no surprise that Blackrock Foundry is easily the shining star of Warlords of Draenor. A gigantic armory made by the Iron Horde to forge weapons and armor for their continuing conquest. I recall the first time I heard about Blackrock Foundry just thinking to myself, how? How can they make a raid about a bunch of brutes in a mine exciting, unique, or even fun? Man, was that feeling a shallow one, because BRF is, in my opinion, the exact checklist of how to make an amazing raid. Not even just in WoW, but in MMOs in general, and dare I say it's one of the greatest raids ever made. Right from the get-go, its layout is extremely smart, supporting the idea of players choosing their paths, much like a lot of the better WoW raids do. But one thing I love about BRF more than a lot of other raids is that it's not just horizontally large, but also vertically. That's right, BRF goes up and down as well. Ooh. I don't know why, but I just really love the idea of going in 2 more directions. Like maybe it's not worthy of me fangirling out over, but its extra verticality helps to stave off any repetition I would get while progressing through the raid. There are a ton of directions you can go in, helping to allow guilds to progress in their own ways. Struggling with Gruul? Why not give Thogar or Darmak a run? And before anyone says, wow, you struggled on X boss? Keep in mind, every guild is different, and while your way of cutting through a raid may have worked for you, it won't always work for everyone else. Outside of its layout, design-wise, BRF is not bad, really. I know, I've complained about Blizzard's oversaturation of the colors orange and red in the past, but here it doesn't seem quite so bad. And I feel like the mixture of more unique physical aesthetics such as train tracks, boats, and cave networks, and the addition of some minor blue hues in the mushroom paths really helps to change things up a bit. Speaking of mushroom paths, I really appreciate that Blizzard not only created a quick way to navigate back to the upper sections of the facility, thanks to these speed-providing little mushrooms, but also directly referenced a much nicer time when dungeons lapped back in on themselves, like in Burning Crusade, which kind of makes sense considering WoD is an expansion pretty much made on the nostalgia and tears of BC fans. Well, the layout and design are solid victories, but what about the bosses? Oh, you mean the amazing, well-crafted roller coaster ride of a series of things referred to as bosses? Why yes, I guess they're pretty decent. There are 10 bosses total, and while I won't say all of them are god-tier leviathans, I'm looking at you Flamebender, you hag, there are some still pretty insanely detailed and memorable bosses here. Depending on what you're looking for, there are more approachable fights that center around a gimmick, like Thogar, Orgorger, or Hans and Franz, which all feel like the dev team just snorted a line of Fireland's boss design and then went full overdose on it, from dodging incoming trains, to avoiding gigantic steel press machines, to whatever the hell this guy is doing. There's a lot of content that felt fun and unique compared to the basic pull out a sword and kill the boss of old. Of course, if you're more interested in that kind of boss design, there is plenty of that mechanically as well. Difficulty is also a big player in BRF, and it spikes in some pretty intense ways, but thanks to the approachable raid layout, this isn't too big of an issue, and allows for players to kind of establish their own curve, while more competitive players can just jump right into the harder challenges sooner. Fights like Blackhand and Blast Furnace easily put some of the best raiding cores on edge, challenging their minds and their skills all in one go, and all while being pretty unique and well-crafted encounters. I mentioned its final boss Blackhand, but really, he could have his own section to be honest, because he's easily one of the best final bosses I've ever done in a raid before. From his intense scope he establishes, to his really awesome effects, you can tell Blizzard really went hard making this encounter memorable and intense, and considering Blackhand is one of the Warlords of Draenor, it kinda makes sense. I mean, the guy just straight up breaks the floor apart till you have a final showdown with him in the deepest parts of the forge, which is pretty metal. BRF is a perfect benchmark for well-crafted raid design, and intense, adrenaline-pumping, but exciting raid bosses, all wrapped into a nicely sized and very fulfilling package, easily making it WoD's biggest achievement and greatest raid. With the easy first choice out of the way, I was now plagued with deciding who took the middle spot, and after careful thought, I settled with WoD's entry raid, Highmaul. The great capital city of the Gorian Empire, Highmaul was a testament to what the great ogres of old could do when they were unified and in full power. So I want to go ahead and lead with the design aspect before I jump into the layout, but I just have to say, man, I really love this place visually. Something about the stone walls and the soothing atmosphere make me really feel at home when I visit this raid, despite it currently being sieged by Pale Orcs. More on that in a moment. I don't know, it's just something about it that really makes me feel comfortable. The overall stonework for the walls is all well made and looks very smooth and natural, and the color scheme is nice and varied enough to not be overbearing like some raids can be. Its layout is extremely well crafted, starting out linear and then opening up after the arena section before returning to a more linear final gauntlet for its second half. It may not be as versatile as Blackrock Foundry, but for a first raid I feel like this works really well in its favor, as it doesn't overload the players with too much right out the gate, slowly easing them into the progression. I mentioned the arena section, but I have to say this is everything Trial of the Crusader should have been in my opinion. Yes, you fight in an arena, but only against one mini-boss and one boss, never forcing you to stick around for too long, making things stagnate. In fact, not sticking around in one place for too long is something Highmaul does rather well. Outside of its pretty solid raid design, its bosses are all pretty fun, and offer some varied but well-handled difficulty, especially on higher modes. I'm a huge fan of the Brackenspore, Tectis, and Margok fights specifically, but honestly have fond memories of Twin Ogrons and Korog too. One thing I've always really loved about this raid is its overall setting and how it establishes its lore on the fly. You start out in an arena before Cho'Gall breaks free and lays siege to the city with his Pale Orc army. This kind of chaos works really well in Highmaul's favor, as it creates a ton of different trash mob options while also creating a sense of urgency in the player as well. This kind of concept hasn't really been done much before, as oftentimes we are the ones laying siege to the city or dungeon, and it's kind of neat to see it from a different perspective. The siege eventually leads to the final boss, and if you're doing him on Mythic difficulty, Cho'Gall even shows up as part of the encounter, ultimately being the true final boss of the fight, which is just amazing and still shocks me every time I see him kill Margok. Honestly, the only thing I can think to ping the raid for is a lack of Pale Orc themed bosses. Outside of Tectis and the final boss on Mythic difficulty, all the bosses are Ogre themed except for Brackenspore, who's just kind of there. I think one or two more bosses with Pale Orc or Void themes would have been a welcome addition. But honestly, this is a very minor gripe in the face of such a majestic and well-crafted raid like Highmaul. So bravo Blizzard, well done. As I stated at the beginning of the previous section, it was no simple task for me to choose who took the last two spots, since all three of the raids are bangers. But at the end of the day, I settled for Highmaul as my second best raid in WoD, leaving the last spot for Hellfire Citadel. I want to be clear though in saying that the term worst is not appropriate here, as Hellfire Citadel is not a bad raid, far from it actually. Set in the Iron Horde fortress now turned Fell base of Hellfire Citadel, it's your job to penetrate this fortress and put a stop to Gul'dan and his nefarious deeds, once and for all, or at least until Legion. Standing in your path to Gul'dan are a total of 13 bosses and an army of Fel-infused orcs, Draenei, and demons trying to prevent you from stopping the Legion's burning crusade on Draenor. Design-wise, HFC looks pretty good in my opinion, having this very creepy and sinister fortress appearance that looks really brilliant. I love how the floor is breaking apart in a ton of places, and how the Citadel itself is slowly warping and twisting due to the Fel corruption. One thing I was a little concerned about the first time I started doing HFC was the large array of green and black color schemes that were going to overwhelm my senses. And this is coming from someone whose favorite colors are, well, green and black. But I'm proud to say that isn't quite the case here. Yes, there are a lot of greens and blacks, but also dark tones of red and even some light blues and purples at some points, which help to change the tone up just a bit for those who might find the colors distasteful or boring. One thing I especially love design-wise is that the second half sections all have unique themes applied to them, from the sky balcony you fight Iskar on, to the sinister halls of the Bastion of Shadows, where you battle against the twisted cult of the Sargerai and their leaders Sakrathar and Velhari. Having this very anti-paladin, anti-light look to everything, which I personally think is really cool. Outside of its design, HFC's layout is pretty good, offering multiple branching paths at certain points to allow players some much needed decision making. In the later sections, Khadgar does set up some portal networks for you, kinda like in Dragon Soul, though I do find it a lot less harmful here than it was in DS, especially since you have to do a lot of walking around in the dungeon to kill bosses before the portals will allow you to move on. The bosses are all pretty solid in my opinion, having a good mix of tank style fights and more unique mechanic fights, from the entry Hellfire Assault encounter all the way up to the fight against Manoroth's bony corpse. And of course we can't skip out on the amazing final showdown with Archimonde, which is easily one of the coolest fights in World of Warcraft, especially on Mythic where he straight up takes you into the Twisting Nether to finish your raid core off once and for all. My only other gripe besides the portal teleporting is that not all the bosses are super amazing, with fights like Hellfire Assault dragging on and some of the more traditional fights being kind of a pain mechanics wise. But these are very minor gripes that don't really bring the raid down all that much. It may not be the best or even second best in my opinion, But I'm proud to say that Hellfire Citadel is an extremely well put together little piece of nostalgia that I thoroughly enjoyed, despite some minor flaws. Well, I have done it. I've ranked all of Warlords of Draenor's raids, all 3 of them. If you enjoyed the list, tell me how you would have ranked them in the comments below. Yes, I know WoD wasn't exactly a great or even good expansion to most people, but I do think it had some great content hidden within its rough outer shell. So let loose, and let's talk about it. As always, if you enjoyed the video, why not subscribe, and check out some of my other videos too. I'm working really hard on some new series ideas, and I can't wait to start putting them on the channel. So stay tuned for that, and more rankings, because next time, it's Pandaland. Well, I'm Captain Potato, and I'll see you guys next time, next video.